Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Game Center Visiting Guest Lecture Series. And the Game Center, for those of you who don't know, is the NYU initiative, which is all about being a resource that gathers together everything that's happening at NYU related to games into one big coherent structure. And we're also offering some new classes so that if you're interested in games and you're a student at NYU, you should be taking these classes. Jesper Juhl's class, Introduction to Video Games, Eric Zimmerman's class, Introduction to Game Design, and also we have the Open Library that's going on. The Game Center is made possible by a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation and from Sharon Chang and the TTSL Charitable Foundation, and by a generous grant from other anonymous donors. So we are extremely excited to have Clint Hocking here tonight for this lecture. And one of the things that I think makes Clint especially interesting is that he's doing work at the very forefront of the industry. He is a creative director at Ubisoft, where he led the design on the critically acclaimed game Far Cry 2, as well as numerous Splinter Cell titles. And so he's doing work on AAA big budget video games, but he's someone who, within that context, is extremely committed to expanding the creative range of games and expanding their emotional capabilities and their sophistication as works of culture.
This is kind of a replay of the talk as it's been going on so far. I'm actually going to go over to Google Earth and show you all the places where this talk is happening, because sort of one of the themes of this talk is that things aren't just happening in the place where they appear to be happening, but they're happening in the larger and grander context that surrounds them. So I actually first gave this talk in my office at Ubisoft in Montreal, where I gave the talk to a bunch of people there as sort of knowledge sharing at the office, and I've completely torn it apart and rebuilt it since then, because the first version of it was really terrible. The second version of it, which was a little bit less terrible, I took to the GameX convention in Philadelphia, where at least one member of the audience actually was almost able to attend, but now he's here. So it's interesting how we're asynchronously distributed across these talks. I took the talk after that to the Electronic Technology Center at Carnegie Mellon, where I gave the talk to a bunch of students there who were way smarter than me, and I kind of embarrassed myself. And then I took it after that to MIT, to the Gambit Game Lab there just yesterday, actually, to another group of students who were way smarter than me, and that was interesting. And then now I'm here, where I'm giving a talk to you guys, and I think I got the pin in the wrong place, but at least you see the general idea of where sorry. Because if I put the pin in the right place, but if I get an interesting view, the pin isn't actually on the screen. So that's a little bit of a bug that we could fix in Google Earth if we wanted to. After this, I go to Savannah, Georgia, which appears to be a town that has absolutely no tall buildings in it. And then I go to across the state to Atlanta to talk to the other campus of SCAD, where actually there are tall buildings, but the campus is like on the side of one of those big monolithic scary freeways. I hope we don't have to have lunch on the other side of it, or I'll be playing some Frogger or something. And then after that, I go back home, and you'll see conveniently my house is like just a few blocks from the office, and so I'm very happy to sort of live and work in my community and not have to be one of these guys who commutes, because commuting is a problem I'll talk about later. Potentially, I will give this talk in December, way down in South America, in Buenos Aires. I'm in discussions with people who are putting together a game conference down in Buenos Aires. I might be able to actually go all the way down there and give this talk there, but that's still to be determined, and we don't know if that's actually going to happen. And actually, I've always wanted to go to Buenos Aires, not just because it's like the city that's destroyed by the Clontathu at the beginning of Starship Troopers, but also because it's where this guy is from. This is Borges, or Borges. I don't speak Spanish, so it's hard for me to say his name, but and he's like a very famous Argentine writer, and I've often been inspired by his writing and by his work and by his thinking. Very smart guy. Probably you've read some of his stuff, but because this talk is about hyperrealism, I'm going to talk quite a bit, or a little bit, about Borges. But before I do that, because this talk is also, in the other part of the title, about immersion, I want to talk about that first. And I actually gave a talk about immersion back in 2008 at the Game Developers Conference, and it was a very difficult talk. I made the mistake of, because I was deep in production on Far Cry 2, I made the mistake at that time when I submitted the concept for the talk of thinking, that'll be a really easy talk because Far Cry is going to be a really immersive game, and so I can just talk about that and I'll be able to get my talk in and it'll be easy for me to prepare it. And I was really wrong, and it turned out to be a really, really complicated and difficult talk that challenged a lot of the things I was thinking about. So just by way of like getting everybody up to speed, I'm going to go and recap that talk in fast forward. So in the talk, I talked about there being two kinds of immersion. There was this kind of formal immersion, what I called it, this kind of left brain kind of formal, rational kind of immersion. And then there was this other kind of immersion, this sort of sensual right brain kind of immersion. And I sort of talked about formal immersion as being the kind of logical, rational immersion that you experience when you're playing a game of chess. And if you look at Gary Kasparov up here getting his ass kicked by Deep Blue, you can tell that this guy is immersed totally in any usable definition that you could come up with. This guy is immersed. You can tell just by looking at him. He is like crunching out all of the possible futures of his chessboard, and there's like literally only one pawn in the middle of the board. So he's like really deep in thought, and there's not a lot to think about. So he's totally focused. And I likened this kind of immersion to Mr. Spock, just kind of as a reference point. And then I talked about this other kind of immersion, which was kind of a sensual, right brain, kind of emotional kind of immersion. It's the kind of immersion that you feel when you're in an art gallery and you see a really beautiful painting and you kind of get lost in it for a little while. Or it's the kind of immersion that you feel when you hear a really beautiful piece of music and it kind of floats you away to somewhere else. A lot of people talk about how they can become sort of overwhelmed by the sense of taste. Like, my girlfriend, for example, my wife now, is kind of obsessed with chocolate, and if she has chocolate, it's kind of a really powerful immersive experience for her. Sex is nothing if not sort of immersion in the tactile sense. And the sense of smell, even though we don't think of it as being something that we immerse ourselves in, it's sort of also the sense that it's sort of most powerfully bonded to like other times and places, and it can kind of, you get that whiff of something that can kind of pull you across decades to some very intense immersive experience where you kind of inhabit it just for kind of a fleeting moment, and then you pop back to where you are. I talked about that kind of immersion as being kind of like Captain Kirk, right? Just to contrast it with Mr. Spock. And I went on to suggest that these two kinds of immersion were always in conflict with one another. There was this idea that if you're, and the example I wanted to use was like, if you're playing Doom, and you're really, really immersed in this simulation of this world, and you're a bit scared, and you're low on ammo, and you're going around these hallways with blood and fire and like reddish light and stuff like that. You really feel like you're in this space, and then you shoot some monsters, and then you see a health kit there. And you look down in the bottom left of the corner, and your health is like at 82, and you know the health kit is 25%. And if you pick up the health kit, you're going to actually go to 100, but you're going to kind of lose the 6 or 7% that you would have got if you picked it up when your health was lower. So you don't want to take it, and so you switch into this kind of Mr. Spock immersion where you're like crunching the numbers and thinking about odds and probabilities of how many monsters and how far along, and whether you should go forward and fight and then come back and get the health later, and you're thinking about your ammo. It becomes this really sort of rationally immersive kind of experience for a second, and then you make a decision, and then probably you leave it and you carry on and you fight a few monsters, and then you come back when your health is at 64 and you grab that 25% and then you carry on. But the point is you're kind of switching back and forth between like Kirk and Spock, and you don't really seem to be able to be both, right? You kind of toggle back and forth between the kind of Kirk immersion and the kind of Spock immersion. Later in the talk, and the talk is on my blog if you want to go and check it out, and all the sort of discussion of it is there. It's not a very good talk, but I mean, later in the talk I suggest that maybe these two guys have this kind of love affair going on, and there's kind of a way that you can maybe bring the two together by taking their shirts off and oiling them up or something like that. And that was sort of the immersion talk. And And then this idea of immersion that I was kind of presenting in this talk was really kind of based on on the sort of later generation of Star Trek version of what the ideal notion of immersion is, which is the holodeck, right? And we're all familiar with this. It's like this idea that if we extrapolate current technology and computers and everything they can simulate into this sort of nebulous future that we can't define, that we have this sort of perfect simulation of immersive context or whatever, and that we can go there and just live there, right? And the holodeck is kind of sexy, and in some ways I think it maybe is an extrapolation of current technology into the future. There are some very, very hard problems that are probably unsolvable, and it doesn't have to be exactly like the holodeck to sort of subscribe to this holodeck vision of what the future of immersion could be like. And it's interesting for sure, but I think that fundamentally the holodeck is really based on a kind of Generation X idea of what immersion could be, and maybe what Generation X wants it to be. One of my favorite bloggers, there's a guy named Steve Gaynor, who's a designer working now at 2K Marin. He's working on BioShock 2, as far as I know, currently. He actually has a really interesting blog that's called Fulbright, and he actually talks on his blog about immersion. And I'm kind of out of space here, so I'm going to go to his blog, which is here. So this is his blog. It's fulbright.blogspot.com, and actually over on the right, he linked this entire series of posts, 3 different posts that he has where he talks specifically about immersion and what it means to him. I'm going to read a sort of excerpt starting from here. In Steve's estimation, every medium has its primary strength. He says, literature excels at exploring the internal, psychological, subjective aspects of a character's personal experiences and memories. Film excels at conveying narrative via precisely authored sequence of meaningful moments in time. And video games excel at fostering the experience of being in a particular place via direct inhabitation of an autonomous agent. I'm not going to read the whole next paragraph, but just to call out a couple points. He says, the meaning of the experience arises from what's contained within the bounds of the game world and the range of possible interactions the player may perform therein. And then he says, video games provide an alternate to both the where and what of existence, resulting in simulated alternate life experiences. So I think those are kind of telling remarks, and I think that they are kind of exemplary of the sort of holodeck model of what immersion is. They also, to me, sound kind of like the Matrix, right? It's like, Generation X, or at least me as a member of Generation X, think of immersion as being this idea of going somewhere where I can be like cool and rich and powerful and famous and smart. And so aside from this idea of simple escape, like aside from, why we go to see, whatever movie we go see at the movie theater, it's like this idea of going somewhere where we can escape into quality content. And by quality content, I don't mean like bug-free, polished AAA titles. What I mean is like going to experience a kind of content that makes my entire reality feel better, feel more qualitatively better than the reality that I live in. It's a great place. We're looking for a great place to immerse ourselves in, or a great person in whom to immerse ourselves. And I think that that's sort of the Generation X dream. It's this idea of entering a better reality and being able to forget. And that's sort of why I have this image up there, being able to forget that our real reality is there at all, right? Generation X is really a powerfully self-destructive generation. Immersion for us is just, on the one hand, it's a chance to escape. It's an opportunity to get away from the pains of being ourselves. We're overloaded all the time. We're children of broken homes and all of those other cliches, which are sort of not necessarily individually true, but maybe collectively more so than previous generations. And that's our idea of what immersion is. It's sort of what I call self-destruction, but via immersion in content. And that immersion in content part is the part I'm going to come back to. Film, as we all know, here in this room anyways, is a tremendously immersive medium, right? You sit in a theater exactly like this one, and the chairs are really comfy, and it shuts off your sort of tactile input stream, and the lights go down, so you can't see anything except the screen, and then the only thing you can sort of see and hear are the things that are being fed to you directly from the film, right? We all know that. And over the last 50 years, and probably concentrated very heavily in the last 20 or maybe the last 30, films seem to have become much, much, much more immersive. I'm actually going to show a couple clips from some films here in order to talk about some specific points. So I have to go there, and then I have to go here. And then I'm going to play this. And the sound works. Sweet. So this is real footage from the Normandy landings. This isn't like footage that Steven Spielberg's B unit picked up on a beach somewhere and it's been treated with like a filter in order to make it good for the History Channel's like retelling. This is the actual footage of war photographers, I think working for the U.S. Army of Defense or U.S. Department of Defense, on the beaches with the guys landing there during the Normandy landings, and these are. Curiously, I actually was corrected on this. These aren't the world's first embedded journalists. Apparently, they also did this in World War I, but I didn't find the footage for that. But the important point is how this footage was used, right? This wasn't just footage that was captured for strategic value. It certainly had that. It's like, let's see how guys react under fire. Let's make sure that this gets to the State Department and we can, see what's going on the battlefield and make different decisions about it. It wasn't just captured for the purposes of history. It's kind of a chronicle of what went on, and that's useful and valuable as well. It was also captured for propaganda purposes. This footage was shown to the American public, so people would see this footage in like newsreels before they would see, Casablanca or something like that. Well, I guess it was a few years earlier, but they would see it before they would see movies in the movie theater, and it was like, these are our boys winning the fight. Thank God we're Americans and all of that, and like buy war bonds now so that we could actually go on and win the war. And it was sort of propaganda to the American people. The point is that the public actually saw this footage, obviously heavily edited and made not horrifying and all that kind of stuff. What's curious is that if we look at sort of how this footage evolved in the public consciousness. So I'm going to go back here, and then I'm going to look at a film that was made in 1957. So this should be up here. Okay, so this is the Stanley Kubrick film Paths of Glory, and actually I only saw it a couple months ago for the first time. I saw it because I was doing some research into this talk and thinking about some different stuff. I'd always wanted to see it. I'd never gotten around to it. Finally watched this. In large part I saw it because I remembered how frequently Spielberg referenced it when he was talking about his inspiration for the footage in The Landing and Saving Private Ryan. What fascinated me, and I have a really nice home theater. I have like a huge LCD screen and the big 5.1 sound and the comfy couch, and I have close to ideal sort of viewing conditions for watching a film and being immersed in it. And what really surprised me watching this film was how unimmersive it was for me. It's impossible for me to say for a 1957 audience how immersive it was for them, but for me, as kind of like a 30-something Gen X dude, there's a few sequences in there where you kind of feel like there's explosions happening very close to the camera, and there's guys who do really tight cross cuts, very abstract movements across the frame. But Kubrick is always cutting back to this master shot. He's always cutting back to this shot that has this very, very objective feeling to it. And for me, whenever that happened, I could literally picture in my head this huge mound of dirt that they'd sort of stacked up alongside of this big field, wherever they filmed this, I don't actually know, and then laid the wooden planks across the top of their mound of dirt and laid their dolly track along the top of that, and their dolly was on there, and their camera, and their cameraman, and their DOP, and Kubrick walking along beside the shot, watching it like this. I could literally picture that in my head, and without trying. Like, this was just an image that was coming into my head as I was watching this sequence, how he's constantly moving back to this sort of very safe, very objective image. And it's curious to me that, this is what he still needed to do, 10 or even 12 years after the fact, when the public had already seen this sort of very in-the-action footage from the Normandy landings, in order to capture this idea of war, and probably still with the intent of very powerfully overwhelming his audience, he still had to cut back to this master shot in order to keep people watching. And I really wondered why that was, right? This is Edward R. Murrow, and I guess CBS is like a couple blocks from here or something, right? So I mean, so we have no idea where it was, is what you're saying. No, but I mean, throughout the 40s and the 50s, and even into the 60s, this idea of objectivism was very in fashion, right? And it was like the kind of, in fashion is maybe the wrong way to put it, but it was very, very important, particularly in journalism. And Edward R. Murrow was like the guy, the good night and good luck guy, who was like in the I think it's a George Clooney film. Him and Soderbergh put it together. He was the sort of face and the voice of the CBS Evening News. And back in his time, like, journalists were considered professionals in very much the same way that like doctors and lawyers and engineers are considered professionals to us today. Like, doctors and lawyers have like certain protections. If you tell your lawyer that you killed your wife or whatever, like, he's not allowed to rat on you. He still has to defend you and all of that, and he doesn't go to jail for not disclosing that information to the court. That's his job, right? So make sure you get a fair trial. Journalists, in some sense, are extended similar protections, similar, not the same, under the Constitution, which makes journalism the fourth estate and protects them from certain kinds of prosecution because they are professionals. They're professionals not in the way that game designers like me are professionals. They're professionals like with a capital P, right? But what happens is into the 50s and 60s, you start to have media companies like CBS and the Evening News coming into fighting for airtime with like, I Love Lucy and shit like that, like primetime entertainment, right? So now the news is sort of in conflict with entertainment, and now more and more people are watching television, and the media companies are buying up the outlets and subsidiaries, and they're getting larger. Meanwhile, the New York Times is sort of going into the bastion of integrity in journalism, if you want to call it that, is coming into conflict with, like, I don't mean with like tabloid spreadsheets, but with like Rolling Stone magazine or something like that into the 60s, where you have a magazine that isn't news per se, but it isn't pap and sensationalist crap either. It's kind of like this hybrid of like, specialist entertainment cultural correspondence, and they're sort of having to fight for the first time for mindshare and stuff like that. They're also getting really big and really powerful and having to answer to their shareholders. And obviously, the idea of the news and this objective idea of journalism is becoming biased and is becoming problematic. Now, in the 21st century, to even say journalism is dead is almost like it's like a wasted breath. It's like, why did you even say that? It's almost, you have to be making some kind of self-referential joke to even say it, because it's so obvious and it's so like sort of, it's so banal to even think it, right? The thing is, back in the 60s, that idea was really kind of troubling, and while people were trying to figure out, like, how do we get around these problems that are starting to rise, this guy, this is Hunter S. Thompson, he wasn't afraid of the idea that journalism was dead. While we were still like trying to think about what to do about it, he was just pumping round after round of hot lead into journalism's like twitching corpse, right? He didn't just reject the notion of objectivism in journalism. He hated it. Like, he wanted to dismantle journalism as we understand it and wreck it. Like, almost it seems like to me, as like a guy who hasn't studied journalism theory at all, as a guy who just wanted to wreck it just to see what would happen. But there was sort of a method behind the madness, right? He was really also kind of inventing this new kind of journalism. He invented this sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Persona. He invented this persona who he called Dr. Gonzo, and he took Dr. Gonzo to go out and cover his stories by kind of immersing himself in the situation and in the sort of global picture of the events that he was trying to cover, in order to get kind of, in some ways, the least objective, but from his perspective, truest story that he could possibly get. And now today, this Dr. Gonzo was like his sort of character persona name, but today we really fundamentally have this word Gonzo that lives in our vocabulary. I mean, you guys all know what Gonzo is, right? I mean, here's a diagram of like a Venn diagram showing the relationship between 18 to 34-year-old males and game developers and users of pornography. So like. So Gonzo is like when the dude in the porno movie is also the dude holding the camera, right? But it's more than that, because it's not just like putting the camera in the hands of someone who's biased and subjectively in the action. It's also, and what Hunter S. Thompson was trying to do that was more important than that, was trying to blur the line between reality and fiction. Like think a little bit like Borat or whatever his name is, but like 30 years ago, right? Trying to confuse you about what's actually happening, right? It's like when the dude in the porno is holding the camera and he's talking to a girl on campus and picking her up to take her back to his place, and it's like, this isn't real because that would never happen, but it's also, it feels really real and it's really strange and confusing, and it's all in the name of like selling fantasy, right? Like there's a very clear agenda. They're selling fantasy, but it's really intended to confuse you and confuse your perception of what's going on. So sort of going back to Paths of Glory, Paths of Glory is not immersive to me today, or maybe to people like me, because in one sense it's always reminding you of the literal or objective truth behind what's going on. And at the same time, my generation just has a really fundamentally different notion of what is immersive than my parents' generation, the baby boomers, did, right? So I actually talked in more detail about this idea of generational shift earlier this year at the Game Design Expo in Vancouver, where I gave a talk called The Next Generation of Player, and I talked about how generations are changing and how that impacts the game industry fairly heavily. Again, I'm going to super fast recap that talk, just going from my slides. This is the first one. I basically started by saying there were three generations that really mattered to the game industry as it stands today. There were the baby boomers, who I kind of represented with Steve Jobs. There was Generation X, who I represented as Tyler Durden. And then there was Generation Y, who I represented as the sort of much better looking and much better dressed Tony Stark. And I talked about how one of the big problems with game development today is that games are really like, game developers are all members of Generation X for the most part, and a lot of players are males of Generation X, and a lot of critics I use that term fairly loosely. Reviewers and people who talk about games, bloggers, are sort of male members of Generation X. And you have this really sort of ugly, incestuous, like snake eating its tail kind of shitty situation where you have guys making games for guys like them, buying games from guys like them, and sort of in this vicious cycle. And that's kind of really a problem for obvious reasons. But then I went and looked at, I went and pulled down all of this demographic data from the U.S. Census Bureau. The top graph shows generational demographics as a percentage of the total population, with baby boomers shown in red and Generation X shown in blue and Generation Y shown in green. The bottom graph shows generational demographics as a percentage of the total workforce with the same color combination. I hope you're not colorblind. The red line in the bottom graph, we see obviously the baby boomers like in around 1980, 85 reaching this peak where they're like almost 60% of the North American workforce. Like they're basically all of the workers in America, or almost all of them. And that number sort of steadily declines until around now, till around 2010, when it sort of starts its real fall off, when baby boomers start to retire or start to be thrown in prison for financial fraud. And then you have Generation X sort of starting to enter the workforce in 1985, reaching a peak which is much, much lower, down at about 33% in about 2000 or so, and then sort of maintaining this long, steady plateau and then dropping off. And then obviously Generation Y starting to enter the workforce about 2000. And there's this really interesting thing that happens in about 2015. And the way I describe it is like, imagine you're at the circus, right? And there's this huge big trapeze show and you're all mesmerized by it, and then the lights go down, and then you look down on the floor and you see all of these clowns doing a whole bunch of stupid shit, pulling like handkerchiefs out of their things and squirting each other with flowers and stuff. So what's happening is the baby boomers are taking down their big awesome trapeze act over here, and Gen Y is putting up this other big awesome trapeze act over here, and the whole world is just focused on this little total waste of time joke of a fucking excuse for entertainment. And everyone's sort of mystified by all of the little clowns, and then suddenly it's like, oh wow, here's the real show again. And that's really sort of feels like in some ways what's happening with Generation Y replacing the baby boomers. And that's sort of going to happen in the American workforce around 2015. The problem is, in the game industry, if you take the sort of explosive growth of workers in the game industry, starting from way back in the 60s when there was like one guy, going to about now where there was like 10,000 people or so in North America making games, and you take this sort of exponential growth and you multiply that curve. And these are my numbers here, so there's a lot of error in guessing going on. But if you multiply this curve by those three other curves, you get something that looks like this. Back in like the 1960s, there's like 100% of the game industry is baby boomers because there's like one or two dudes making games, right? But then as you move forward in time and the number of people making games ramps up very quickly, you get into the 90s. And if you look at around 1990, you see that about 50% of the people making games are boomers and the other 50% are Generation X. And give or take 3 or 4 years, that gels pretty well with my understanding of who was making games around the early 90s. And then you see again the boomers sort of falling off, not because they're leaving, but because there aren't more boomers coming in. I mean, they're all bankers with like steady jobs. They're not going, I know, honey, I'm going to quit my job and start making video games. They're like stuck in their careers, and now more and more Generation X guys are coming into the game industry, and the numbers in the industry are swelling. Around about 2000, Generation X hits their peak, and we reach a peak of something like 80% or 81 or 82% of the population of game developers. The boomers in game development circa 2000 are literally like presidents and CEOs and guys like holding the purse strings. They're still important. We can't discount their importance, but they're a very small percentage of the people making games. And then what happens, and this is the really interesting thing, is that Gen Y starts to enter, and their growth is really explosive. They're coming out of colleges and schools with educations in game development, and that sort of crossover where Generation X and the boomers get replaced by Generation Y, instead of happening in about 2015, seems to happen in about 2008. And like I said in the little Google Earth tour, I gave this talk in Montreal at the beginning. We have about 2,000 people in our office. And and I had about this many people in the room. There's about 70 or 80 people. And just as a show of hands, I said, how many people in this room are members of Generation X, using the years I had on that previous slide. And about 50% of the people in the room put their hands up, and the other 50% were Generation Y. I know for a fact if I'd asked that question like 4 years ago, every single person in the room was in Generation X. But now, it's already at 50-50. So whether it's 2007, 2008, 2009 is kind of immaterial. This thing that we think about as sort of being in the future for the rest of the North American workforce in 2015 has pretty much already happened for the game industry. This huge generational shift has already happened. Where do I go? I'm lost. So there's this really curious thing where once upon a time, baby boomers had this idea of a perfect solution to their commuter problems, right? They were professionals and they had all the power. They'd suddenly, taken over from the war generation. They were running the world. And they found that they had to, go from their barbecue in their backyard in their pool and drive for 45 minutes to get to work. And then it became 55 minutes, then it became an hour and 10, and it became an hour and a half, and then it became, an hour and 40 minutes. And that kind of sucked, and they didn't really like that very much. And there was this idea that the future would bring like jetpacks and flying cars, and commuting would just go away. Technology would solve this problem. When I gave this talk in Vancouver, I referenced the idea that Vancouver was the place where Expo 86 had taken place back in my childhood. The theme of Expo 86 was like transportation, how modernization of industrialized transportation would change the future for everyone. It was literally about fucking spacemen and flying cars and jetpacks. Like, you're kidding me, right? The problem with that idea, of course, is that you can't really just extrapolate technology into the future just arbitrarily. We could build flying cars and jetpacks now if we just didn't care about other stuff. It would be dangerous and crazy and lots of people would die, but we could do it, right? There's nothing stopping us from building these things, sort of technologically speaking. But what happened was, around the same time that this dream was sort of burning out its wick, this other thing came along, and it was called the internet, and people started to think, like, instead of investing billions of dollars in lives and all sorts of craziness and weirdness and problems into this idea of jetpacks and flying cars, let's invest in this nascent technology that's growing. And the people who were starting to enter the workforce were really keen to do this, and this technology just started to explode. I mean, so the point is, like, this idea that you can just extrapolate without thinking about the people or the context of what's going on is kind of obvious and foolish, right? I mean, I think I can go back to my real presentation here. Yes. It seems feasible in some ways that we could extrapolate from, what we imagine as being the ultimate immersive experience through technology to come to sort of the perfect holodeck-like immersive experience. But, remember, once upon a time, it seemed feasible that we could extrapolate from, cars like we have to like flying cars and jetpacks. And yeah, like I said, you can't extrapolate without considering the people and the culture and what's going on. So the real question is sort of what changes would or maybe are going to lead, Generation Y, these new generation of people coming into the workforce, away from this pursuit of the sort of ultimate classical Generation X immersive experience towards something new and different that we maybe haven't really thought very much or enough about yet. While I was renting movies in order to do my research for this talk, one of the movies I rented had this sort of ad, and this was kind of like a linchpin that put a lot of things into place. This is an ad on a DVD for the Blu-ray experience, right? So this is the idea that while you're watching Batman, instead of just having director commentary on a recorded track talking to you while you're watching, with the Blu-ray experience, you can sort of watch the movie and have a virtual live community screening with the director, who's like chatting with people in the chat community about the film, live and interactive while you're watching the movie, right? So it's not just like this canned recorded thing, it's this real interactive, like distributed thing that's going on. Sort of all of these sort of new networking and sharing and community features are being layered over top of these sort of traditional DVD features. But just think about for a second what it would do to your notion of the sort of immersive experience of a film if that was sort of embedded everywhere. What I'm going to do quickly is just, because I kind of got out of order here, I'm going to jump over here and I'm going to show this piece of footage, which you've probably all seen before, so I'm not going to show too much of it. So I particularly like that part of it because sitting in a kind of dimly lit theater that isn't the sort of classical immersive experience that you would have for watching this, the part of the sequence where you're kind of going in and out of the water as though you're walking along carrying this heavy load and your head comes out of the water, the audioscape is changing along with the sort of visuals, right? So you can hear this sort of very muffled, deadened, like underwater environment, and then your head comes up and you hear the bullets whizzing past and the clacking and all the stuff that you can't hear underwater, and you're switching back and forth. So it's very, very immersive, and it's very apparent that this is a really immersive experience. But let's just imagine for a second what that would be like if you were watching this footage with a bunch of people that you don't know, talking about it over in your chat windows, and Steven Spielberg was there talking about how, you know, all of the technological wizardry and all of the inspiration that went into this film, while he's showing a clip from Paths of Glory, talking about how that inspired him, picture in picture in the thing, and, you know, this would completely shatter the kind of idea of immersion that we carry with us today, right? This would just like, it would just blow your head apart. You wouldn't feel like you were there on the beaches of Normandy. You would feel like you were in some other thing. And in very large part, I mean, that's the thing that I'm trying to talk about in a very hard way today. Just imagine for a second if, to use a sort of simpler example, if while you're watching Saving Private Ryan, you know, the camera points at Tom Hanks and he says, like, we got to go over there and secure that bunker or whatever, and then the camera cuts over and shows the bunker and it comes back, but instead of being Tom Hanks this time, it's like Harrison Ford. And then he says, come on, man, let's go. You'd be like, what the fuck just happened? And then it would cut back, and then you'd see, you know, some machine gun fire open up, and it would cut back. And then imagine it's like Brad Pitt. And he's like, come on, guys. You'd be like, what the hell? You can't do that. You can't just switch like actors like that. That's totally weird. It would push you right out of the film, and it would completely wreck the entire experience for you, right? This is my mom. My mom is a production accountant in the film industry, which, as near as I can tell, is pretty much the exact opposite of being a creative director in the game industry. One of my mom's last jobs, not her last one, but one of the ones she did in the past year or so, she was the production accountant on Terry Gilliam's last film, which, if you're an accountant, is a really, really bad thing to be. Terry Gilliam is like cursed, right? And for those of you who don't know, like this guy just has the worst luck. He's really close to being blacklisted in Hollywood. If you haven't seen the film Lost in La Mancha, about his attempt to make the film of Don Quixote, I highly recommend it because it's this sort of absolutely fascinating portrait of filmmaking gone totally to shit. So during the making of the Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus, Heath Ledger, the main actor, and I actually don't know the story, but he's the star, right? Heath Ledger died during the production, right? And that's a total disaster, and that's a total Terry Gilliam thing to happen. Like, and you know, you can just picture him if you've seen the movie. Like, it's just not my fault, right? Like, what am I supposed to do about that? It's totally impossible that would happen, and yet it happened. And I'm actually going to show the trailer from that film just so we can get an idea of what the solution to that problem turned out to be. Because I remember my mom talking to me in the days after that happened. I happened to call her and she said, I'm working on this film, and you know, I'd watched with my wife that same week the Lost in La Mancha, and she was saying, you know, like, what are they going to do? They're talking about casting Johnny Depp to play the same character in different parts of the film, and maybe they can edit around it and make him look like Heath Ledger, and it's really confusing. So this is their solution.
1,000 years ago, Dr. Parnassus made a deal with the devil. Stop! You're probably not a betting man, are you? To gain immortality. Then what? But this came with a price.
Any child wed at the age of 16 belong to him.
Now, a mysterious outsider
Can you put a price on your dreams?
will take the traveling show beyond their imaginations.
The extraordinary Dr. Parnassus. What are you doing? Trying to save your daughter's life, sir?
You could save her. What do you say? First the 5 souls.
Well,
Yeah, that's not my ad at the bottom. There's a sort of a double irony in the fact that that's revealed there at the end. So yeah, I mean, so Terry Gilliam's solution, in fact, didn't turn out to be let's get Johnny Depp to like play the part and we'll see if we can cover it up. It was let's put it on the surface and let's not just get Johnny Depp. Let's also get Colin Farrell and Jude Law and get all these famous actors to play the same character and mix it up and sort of play with people's expectations and confuse them a little bit. So admittedly, what I was saying about, imagine Saving Private Ryan where we switch the actor as we cut between scenes. It's kind of a straw man, like I admit it, right? If you did it that way so that you would cut and then cut back and surprise, that would suck and that would ruin everything for everybody and it wouldn't work. But there are ways to do it. There are ways that you can play with the very fabric of the thing that you're making in order to manipulate people's expectations and not push them out in the same way, in a way that works. There's actually, interestingly, this isn't the only film that has had multiple actors playing the same character. In fact, it's not the only film in the last year or so. In fact, it's not the only film in the last year or so starring Heath Ledger. There was another film called I'm Not There, where Heath Ledger and about 5 or 6 other actors played Bob Dylan. And I didn't find that film to be immersion shattering at all. Like, it's just switching who he is, and it's a little bit hard to understand, and it's a very arty kind of film, but there's definitely no question that there's this continuity and this thing that's comprehensible. There's this through line that you can maintain. And it's not just film that can do this, even though we think that if you were to do something like this, you have to really be careful about it. And you would certainly, even if someone like a genius like Terry Gilliam can do it in a film, we certainly shouldn't probably try and do something like that in a game, right? But then there's this game called Left 4 Dead, and this concept is something I'm going to call substitution continuity. It's the idea that we can maintain this continuity at a sort of higher order of understanding in the audience, even though we're substituting things out that would normally confuse or interfere with their sort of appreciation and sense of immersion. I can play Left 4 Dead with Frank and Eric, and then Frank can go to the bathroom, and a bot can be playing Zoe for like 15 minutes, and I could not even realize that had happened. And he pops back in and says, "Hey guys, I'm back. I just went and had a cigarette. I'm sorry. What did I miss?" It's like, what the hell? Like, you weren't even gone, dude, because we don't even notice, right? There's this whole reality wherein Zoe can only do the things that Zoe can do, and Zoe still says the things that she would say, and Frank can't really behave very much unlike Zoe in the way that he plays the game, because really all that Zoe can do is just shoot zombies and like throw Molotov cocktails and stuff like that. So really his absence doesn't change anything. It certainly doesn't sort of shatter my immersion the way that we normally would think that it maybe would. In Gears of War, there's this sort of crouched dash action called the roadie run. Probably most of you have played it, or at least are a little bit familiar with it, but it's like when you crouch, Marcus, and you kind of use it sort of to run from cover to cover, or like when you're under fire. And it's called the roadie run for reasons that are kind of strange and unrelated. But the idea is when he does this run, it's kind of a dash, and he runs faster than normal, and he can't shoot, so it's kind of, the idea is it's balanced. But the camera drops down behind him and kind of has this sort of wobbly, kind of bouncing over the terrain, asynchronous sort of distortion going on that makes you feel like sort of battlefield cameraman action going on. And it feels very powerful and very authentic. I completely admit it. And the question I have is like, where does this feeling come from? Right? What is it that is making me feel that this is the powerful and authentic idea of what it means to run across a battlefield? How do I know, what it feels like to run across a battlefield under machine gun fire? This is a painting by, I thought it was French, but I've been told yesterday he's Belgian, the Belgian painter Magritte. And the translation underneath that says that this is not a pipe. So it's a painting of a pipe that says within the painting, this is not a pipe, right? And this sort of, the talk is kind of titled Hyperrealism, and it's about hyperrealism in games. And this painting is kind of core to hyperrealist thinking. And the basic idea, the very core of the idea is that the representation of the thing is distinct from the thing that is being represented. And that takes me back to Borges, and he actually wrote a very interesting short story that's about this idea, and specifically as opposed to pipes and paintings of pipes, it's actually about the relationship between maps and territories. And I'm going to read this entire short story to you because it's really short. And it would be weird to only excerpt it. So the entire short story goes like this. Of Exactitude in Science is the title. In that empire, the craft of cartography attained such perfection that the map of a single province covered the space of an entire city, and the map of the empire itself an entire province. In the course of time, these extensive maps were found to be somehow wanting, and so the College of Cartographers evolved the map of the empire that was of the same scale as the empire, and that coincided with it point for point. Less attentive to the study of cartography, succeeding generations came to judge a map of such magnitude cumbersome, and not without irreverence they abandoned it to the rigors of sun and rain. In the western deserts, tattered fragments of the map are still to be found, sheltering an occasional beast or beggar. In the whole of the nation, no other relic is left of the discipline of geography. And then he quotes it from The Travels of Praiseworthy Men, 1658, which is actually fake. It's a literary forgery, so he's quoting a literary source that doesn't exist. It's kind of playing with all of that sort of metafictive, fun stuff. But the point is, Borges was a really smart dude, and he wrote some stuff that really challenged the way we think about a lot of stuff, but it's really, really apparent from reading this that Borges just never imagined Google Earth, right? Borges' idea of a map was just sort of fundamentally inseparable from the idea of paper, right? Maybe he imagined that you could put a map on stone or that you could carve it into wood or something like that. But for him, the sort of practical limitation of mapness, the utility limit of mapness was defined by the utility limits of paper. And for us, we have this very, very different idea of what a map is. There's sort of been this change in technology that just not only sort of makes paper kind of not that important, it kind of just removes it from the equation, and doesn't just mean that we have maps on a screen that are like paper maps. It means we have maps that are of a fundamentally different nature than paper maps. And that utility limit that's been imposed by the idea of paper is just completely removed. And it's changed fundamentally the way we think about stuff. So hyperreality, and this is my definition, something becomes hyperreal when our mediated reference for the thing becomes the definition of what the thing ought to be. So going back to the roadie run, Cliff Bleszinski, designer of Gears of War, who I think is actually also a really smart guy and who has challenged a lot of the things that I would normally question about games. Cliff Bleszinski, bless his heart, has no idea what it means to run across a battlefield under machine gun fire. Neither do I. Neither probably does anybody in this room. There are some arguments that could be made that possibly not very many people on Earth know what it means to run across a battlefield under machine gun fire, although I'm sure there are some. But to all of us, when we play the game, it feels authentic. We just say that is what it feels like to run across a battlefield under machine gun fire. And the way we get that, and the way we have and subscribe to that authenticity, that feeling that we say is credible and that we believe in, comes from that original Normandy footage that I showed you, as interpreted and turned into a film with its sort of safeguards against freaking out the audience, that was made by Kubrick, which was then influenced, back in sort of this loop back to the original historical reference by Steven Spielberg in The Making of Saving Private Ryan, and then became a sort of principal influence on Cliff Bleszinski for how to capture that feeling of what it means to be a kind of gonzo cameraman running across a battlefield in the whole thick of a nest of horrible machine gun fire. The point is that people praise the authenticity of this sort of this feeling of running across the battlefield, who have absolutely no real idea of what it is. They have this sort of hyper-real idea of what the authentic feeling of running across a battlefield is actually like. If you read anything about hyperrealism, one of the things you run into a lot is discussions of Las Vegas. It's kind of like the classical example of what hyperrealism is. So this is a picture of Las Vegas. Oops, I knew I would screw that up. These are some other pictures of Las Vegas. This is a photosynth of Las Vegas, in particular of the Luxor Casino and the Sphinx in front of it, and the obelisk behind the Sphinx. I don't know if you guys know what this website is. It's pretty cool though. It's like a Microsoft sort of skunkworks kind of thing going on. Anyways, it's online. It's photosynth.net, and you can just go check it out. Basically, what it is you go here and you like upload your vacation pictures or whatever you want, and you click on synth, and it's not like you go there and you take 100 pictures of a thing and then you have to sort of manually position them so they all overlap. You go there, you upload your photos, you click a button, and what their computers do is they parse your photos looking for markers in the photographic information. They turn those markers into a bunch of like points called a point cloud, which is this, right? And those points are points that are shared by multiple different photos. And there used to be a version of Photosynth where you could actually walk around in the point cloud. That's not there anymore. I don't know why, so you can only get a kind of glimpse of it as I switch between. But the point is, this is a completely aggregated reality. This is a procedurally aggregated reality made out of a collection of different fragments. This is another version of the same thing. This is, GTA San Andreas looking at the Sphinx and the casino behind it in a photosynth that someone also uploaded. I find it, I sort of wonder what would happen if you dumped these two photosynths into the same folder. Here's the point cloud for this thing, which is, why is it only doing the, okay. So the point cloud is different, but I mean it still has very similar markers in it and very similar relationship between the spaces. And I think that's really kind of cool, actually. Go back to my, yes. As an aside, oops. Spore is a game that actually happens to be made out of procedurally aggregated fragments. When we're playing Spore, we're not immersed in the sort of content of an authored universe. I'm not playing Will Wright's Spore. You're not playing my Spore. I'm playing Spore whose content is aggregated together procedurally out of like this dude's tanks and this dude's buildings and this dude's creatures and all of these things being thrown together procedurally to create the content experience that I can play in. Yes, I can subscribe to an entire packaged universe of another user if I want to, but mostly what's happening is you're pulling down assets from other people and they're being aggregated and put together. The algorithm isn't trying to make the same kinds of matches that it's making in the photosynth case, but the point is that all of these things are being brought together and overlaid on top of each other in the same way. In Vegas, everything is obviously fake, right? And it purposely appears fake in order to make sure that you're aware that it's fake. They want you to know that it's fake, and that's sort of the underlying psychology of Vegas and kind of the thinking behind it. Vegas is sort of intentionally leveraging something that's very fundamental about games, and it's doing it in a very powerful and, in my opinion, a very insidious way. What I mean by that is, if you saw two guys fighting on the street, like if you walked out of here and saw two guys like punching each other in the face and there was blood and like a broken piece of tooth and like, a scuffed knee and like, a fist that gets banged into a window and the window shatters and they're shouting in different languages and it's really crazy, you'd probably be like kind of horrified and a little bit sickened, right? You might take out your phone and take a picture so you had evidence to give to the police, or you might call the police. You'd certainly tell like your friends about it later on, and in telling them you would get this sort of elevated like adrenaline reaction and it would freak you out. The point is, like, seeing two people fighting for real is like a really uncomfortable and kind of frightening and disgusting experience. If you go to a hockey game, on the other hand, you feel like you got what you paid for, right? What happens on the ice in a hockey game, it's not like criminal assault like it would be on the street, right? Like, look at this dude in the back. He's like smiling and stuff. Like, he's like, yeah. It's legal, it's legitimate, it's encouraged, it's even in some ways expected, and because it's a game, everybody knows, the players and the spectators included, that what's happening is happening within the rules of the game. It's part of the what we call the ludic contract between the players, and it's fair game, we say, right? And the players, and in the case of a spectator sport, the spectators are all part of this sort of parallelism. We understand that there's this universe with rules and laws and order where people can't punch each other in the face. And then we understand that there's this other universe which is completely contained within it, where punching people in the face is totally permissible. And you have to sit in a little cube for 5 minutes when you do it, or 2 minutes. And the idea is that when players play this game, or when people spectate this game, we're subscribing to the consequences of these kinds of actions. We know what these actions are, and we know what can happen, and we subscribe to the consequences of them. Subscription consequence happens in another game called BioShock. I'm a guy who lists System Shock 2 as his kind of like favorite game of all time. Actually, when I was at MIT yesterday playing their demo games on their big screen, their screensaver was the face from System Shock 2, and that happens also to be the screensaver on my phone. So I thought that was kind of ironic, but I mean, I love System Shock 2 not only because it's an awesome atmospheric, moody game like BioShock, but I really like that idea that I make decisions early in the game. I like put my little chips in me that upgrade me, and those decisions are permanent, right? I upgrade my hacking skill to level 2. You know, that's a decision that's going to last me 25 more hours until the end of the game, and if I'm going to do that, I better be intent on doing a lot of hacking because it's an expensive investment. In BioShock, which is ostensibly a sequel to System Shock 2, they took that out, and at first, as a player and a fan of System Shock 2, I was like, well, you can't do that. That wrecks everything. That wrecks the immersion in System Shock 2. You can, like, you know, put your points in hacking and fireballs and ice and whatever it is, and then at any point in the game you can get to a little machine and you can cash all your points back in and respend them on different stuff however you want, whenever you want. And what you're doing when you do that is sort of subscribing to this packet of consequence that comes immediately after that sequence. I get to the room and I'm like, well, it looks like there's a lot of, you know, plants in there, so probably if I have my fire powers and I probably don't need hacking, and I sort of reconfigure myself for the challenges that I foresee, I subscribe to the consequences and then I go forward and deal with them and carry on. The point is, this thing that I thought would destroy my immersion actually doesn't destroy my immersion. It actually becomes part of the framework of the game and part of something that I understand, and if anything, it doesn't ruin the game for me, it enhanced it, and it's, you know, very surprising for me to say that. The point is that more so than literature or film, games are exceedingly self-aware. When you are playing a game, you know, and I would say that probably you always know that you are playing a game. More than that, the developers know that you know, right? In Duke Nukem, this is a screenshot from Duke Nukem. Even though it looks like Doom because this is a secret area, which in itself is kind of an out-of-the-box kind of concept. In Duke Nukem, that is textured to look like Doom, and there's a dead space marine on the ground, and when you find this secret area and walk into it, Duke is triggered to say, that's one doomed space marine, right? So, like, the developers are referring to the fact that you know you're playing Duke Nukem and you've probably played Doom, and they know that you're playing Duke Nukem and that you've probably played Doom, right? It's literally reminding you that you're playing a game and you probably played this other game, but again, it's not immersion shattering. I mean, imagine if in Saving Private Ryan, right, if Tom Hanks went, that microphone's a little close to my head, right? You'd be like, what the fuck? You'd be out, right? But in Duke Nukem, we do this all the time. And in lots of games we do this. It's just not a problem, right? It's not immersion shattering because in some sense, we're not immersed in the story and the universe. We're immersed in the entire ludic experience, and we're always aware that we're immersed in that. And I think that is what immersion in a game is by its very nature, and I don't think you can deny it or take it away. When you're playing a game and you're aware, you're always aware of this boundary between what's real and what's fake, and that's sort of the evil thing about Vegas. Vegas is attempting to surround you in this entire universe of fake stuff that's visibly fake, and Vegas is intentionally blurring the line between what is real and what is fake in order to trick you into thinking that what you're losing is part of the fake part of what's going on here and not part of the real part, right? It's like if the man in the orb gambles away all of his money, the guy holding the orb, well, he's probably okay because he's holding the orb and he's in charge of everything that goes on in the orb, right? But I mean, after all, I mean, you're safe and you're looking at it and that's all fine. So what happens to the dude inside the orb, well, that's his business and we don't really need to worry about that, right? I mean, that's really sort of fundamentally what Vegas is doing. It's playing games with this parallelism in order to bankrupt you. There's another game that plays games with this parallelism. And I haven't had a chance to actually play it extensively online, but I've talked to some friends who have and discussed some of the features. In Demon Souls, for those of you who haven't had a chance to play it yet, the idea is that there's like little blood splatters. So this game's really difficult and you die a lot, and often you die in like really shitty ways. Like you walk through a door and you get killed by a falling boulder. There's no way you could know. Oh, boulder, I'm dead. But in this game, there's like blood splatters that you can see on the ground, and those blood splatters are created in your instance of the game by other people who are playing the game who have died there. And if you interact with those blood splatters, they can sort of show you a little ghost of what happened to the dude who died there. So you're actually sort of subscribing and, in a sense, peering through into the parallel reality of another player's game experience to see what happened to that other player and maybe get a little hint about whatever, unfortunate fate befell him. Where am I? The point is, even though you sort of feel like you're kind of immersed in this whole universe and characters and story and world, the thing you're actually aware in and you are actually immersed in, and the thing you are aware you are immersed in is broader, and it steps outside the framework of those things that are happening in the context, in the content. You're actually immersed in the sort of overarching context of the entire play experience. And that's a point I want to make, is the difference between immersion in content and immersion in context, and I'll come back to that a bit. But there's more stuff I want to say about hyperrealism, and I don't really know how to get there from Demon Souls, so the way I get around that is I put this picture of Obama up on screen, and everybody laughs a little bit, and then I change subjects, and I talk about Superman. So this is Alex Ross's picture of Superman. And Superman, I love this picture of Superman. This picture like almost brings tears to my eyes when I look at it. It's so beautiful. It's like this powerful, human, like American picture of what Superman is. It's like, it's Americana, right? People say a lot like, Alex Ross is influenced by Rockwell. Apparently he says he's not, but it doesn't really matter. The point is, like, you have that real sort of 1950s like work ethic feeling. Like I can just see the sort of scotch and soda sitting beside his left hand on the side there, like after a hard day's work. Not like alcoholic scotch and soda, but like Ward Cleaver scotch and soda, right? Like, maybe Ward Cleaver was an alcoholic. He probably was. I think one thing I think is really fascinating about Ross and most of his depictions of superheroes is the way he depicts the superhero costume, and I'm going to talk about that quite a bit. You see the folds in the fabric on the costume, and that makes everything, that's hyperrealism. That makes everything feel very real, and it's hyperrealism because of this, right? Back in the 70s, and in the 80s, we had this idea of Superman that was like this sort of Davidian, statuesque, like perfect musculature, even though the musculature is totally imperfect and alien and weird. The point is, it looks to the sort of unknowing eye like that's what human muscles look like in their perfect form, right? And more than that, his costume is like, it's almost like a tattoo, right? Like it's like lines at his wrist, and like the only place that it isn't like sort of perfectly skin tight and pure is like around his like package and stuff, so you can't like see his stuff, right? But other than that, it's like he's perfect. He's sort of the perfect masculine image of heroism, right? But then you have this other image of him, which is the image that real people saw, right? The public at large saw of like a dude that kind of looks like a wimpy child molester in pajamas, right? He's not even wearing spandex. He's wearing kind of like that stretchy cotton stuff, because I think spandex hadn't been invented yet. But it's kind of like, no matter how like strong-jawed this guy is, when you compare him to the drawing, like he kind of looks weak-jawed. No matter how broad-chested and muscular he is, he kind of looks like wimpy and lame. No matter how skin-tight and perfect his costume looks, it looks like underoos, right? There's no way around it. And this sort of image of Superman really impacted people's understanding and perception of what Superman was, and more than that, what it meant to be someone wearing a superhero costume, right? Also, Lego Superman and Lego Clark Kent are really cool. For comic book people, that kind of change in the social, cultural perception of superhero costumes was a real problem. It suddenly meant that even though we'd reached this broader audience by making this superhero comic, and people could watch, people might be attracted to reading comic books, suddenly they were reading comic books about guys who didn't guys wearing like pajamas, and it sucked, right? And Alan Moore tried to deal with this exact problem in The Watchmen. He in the character of Dan Dryberg, who is sort of Night Owl of the sequel, you have this man who is tremendously, tremendously insecure. And throughout the entire novel, almost, he wrestles with issues of impotence and insecurity and issues of identity that I'll talk about later. There's a scene where there's sort of a top and tail sort of thing that goes on where he almost has sex with Laurie, the sort of female superhero in the story, and he's sort of impotent and he's unable to get it up and perform. And then that kind of ends badly. And then later, a couple chapters later, they go out in their superhero costumes and like save some people from a burning building, and they end up having sex in his his owl ship, his like flying Batmobile thing. And after that, she says to him, "Was it the costumes that made it good, Dan?" And he says, "Yeah. And for the first time, I kind of feel strong and virile." And that's the whole sort of thing that's going on there, is that the costume, the costume gives him strength. And costumes play a really important role through all of Watchmen. And if you read it carefully and kind of look at it, it's very interesting. For the most part, costumes for these characters represent weakness. For Dan, as I said, the costume is kind of a crutch, right? Without it, he feels kind of weak and lame and like a loser. When he has it on, it gives him this kind of confidence that he doesn't have outwardly. For Ozymandias, who's the sort of, spoiler, he's sort of the villain. For Ozymandias, the costume is a shackle. He's the first character in the story when superheroes are made illegal to renounce his superhero guise and reveal his identity and become a public figure. And by casting away that shackle, he actually becomes like the richest, most famous dude in the world. He becomes like, Bill Gates, but impossibly tough. And then for Silk Spectre, the female character who sleeps with Dan, her costume is kind of like this weird kind of melancholy, like hand-me-down. It's kind of like her mother's wedding dress that she's sort of being sort of awkwardly forced to wear. Like she doesn't really want it, but it's kind of got this sort of Victorian sadness to it that's kind of a little bit sort of depressing. And for the comedian, whose costume is all like this like leather and zippers and like bondage motif, representing the sort of secret sexuality side. It's also like a secret. His costume is like his dark secret. It's his shame. He keeps it locked away in a secret compartment where no one can know where it is. He's one of the only superheroes who still operates as a superhero, and he's like an assassin who like kills foreign dignitaries and shit like that. He's like a bad man, and his costume is very secret and shameful. Not just for him, but for his entire culture in a sense. And for Rorschach, perhaps most meaningfully, Rorschach is like the dude who's basically omnipotent, right? He gets these powers in the very beginning, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry. For Rorschach, very obviously, the costume is like a manifestation of his psychoses. So like it shifts around and he's crazy, and yeah, that's really obvious and easy. For Dr. Manhattan, who's like omnipotent and kind of godlike, his costume it's really interesting. When he first gets his powers and he's like this omnipotent dude who can do anything and he's working for the government, he has this full body costume that comes down to his wrists and in his ankles, and he looked kind of weird and goofy in it, skin tight. And then, a decade later, it's kind of like, 1940s like bathing suit, like thigh length and like, tee or sort of wife beater like straps, 40s man's bathing suit. And then in like the 60s or something, it's like a bikini brief. And then in the modern times of the story, he's naked. His costume is actually representative of his humanity, which in some ways is his weakness, but in some ways it's the salvation. But the point is, the casting off of the costume, the removal of the costume over time, is representative of his disposing of his humanity, his gradual isolation from the things that make him human. So in a sense, that's his weakness there is his humanity. And Dr. Manhattan, of course, we perceive that story of how his costume goes away and how his life is perceived in this really distributed and sort of broken apart, scattered kind of postmodern way, because Dr. Manhattan sort of experiences all time at once, it seems, as you get into the story. And there are traditionally there aren't very many movies that can really play with time in that kind of way. There are some, but for us, reading The Watchmen for the first time and seeing this unraveling of what he is and what it means, and coming to understand it is this powerfully immersive experience. Not just an experience of being in that story, in that world, but it's also this sort of enlightening experience of a sort of singular perception of time. And there are a couple of games that manipulate time in really strange ways that we don't really think about very often. In GTA, there's this bizarre temporal asynchronicity between time as it passes in the world and time as it passes on missions in the game. When you're playing the game, if you just play the game nonstop for several hours, you'll see this 24-hour day-night cycle run, and the sun will rise and set, and the moon will rise and set, and the weather will come and go, and it's just all linear, simulated time, right? If you take a mission at like 6 o'clock in the morning, and then you have to go, run over some old lady on the other side of town. You drive over there, and then you get in a chase with the cops, and then you flip over your car, and it's 6 in the afternoon, and then you get busted, and then you get sent to the jail, and it's 9 o'clock at night, and then you get let out of jail, and it's like midnight, okay? It's gone from 6 in the morning linear time to midnight. Now, you got to go take that mission again, and you go back and talk to the guy who gave you the mission. We don't go back to 6 o'clock in the morning when you started the mission. We just start the mission again there, right? It's like the story kind of goes back to the beginning, but time doesn't rewind. It's like the story just time in the universe keeps going forward, but the story has rewound, which is really, really bizarre. If that happened in Pride and Prejudice, you'd be like, that doesn't make any fucking sense at all. But in GTA, most people don't even notice it, and more importantly, notice it or not, no one cares, right? And we think that you can't do it, but actually you can. And if someone had told me that that was the way we were going to structure missions and world time in Far Cry 2, I would have said no. We're trying to make this game as immersive as possible, and we can't. We have to sync the mission time with the world time. It has to be that way. And lo and behold, there's absolutely no reason to make that assumption. There's another game that plays with asynchronicity and also impermanence in time in really strange ways that we don't normally think about. Braid, which I hope most of you have played at least a little bit of, just to understand how it works. Like in Braid, you can rewind time, but time rewinding and the way time moves forward is different for lots of different things in the game. So you're not just playing I like to say you're playing a three-dimensional game, but it's like 2 dimensions because it's a 2D platformer plus time instead of a 3D game. But if you pick up that puzzle piece in the top and then rewind time, you don't put the puzzle piece back. You just keep the puzzle piece forever. The puzzle pieces are permanent collectibles, and when you get them, they're sort of part of the meta layer of the game, and you just keep them forever. If you jump into this pit of spiky lava, you die, but then you press the rewind, and you just actually come back to life, and time goes backwards, and that's okay. So death isn't permanent, but picking up puzzle pieces is. If you go up and flick that switch at the top of that ladder, and then rewind time, the switch unflicks. But if you pick up a key and unlock a door and rewind time, the door... it depends on the door. There's some doors that reclose and give you back the key, I think, and there are some doors that don't. And there's different coding for how the keys glow and all of that stuff. So it's all stuff that you're playing with, and there are little puzzles built around how you navigate the game based on this. So the point is, there are all these things that we can do that in film or in other very immersive media that we think are sort of benchmarks and hallmarks of immersion that we need to aspire to. They can't do things like this, and yet we can do these things in games, and we actually don't think that they break the immersive quality of the experience at all. Back to Watchmen, I think one of the reasons Watchmen has a real audience today, or at least a more real audience than maybe it did in 1986 as a comic book, is just because Moore was aware of the sort of social and cultural baggage that people have regarding superheroes, and in particular superhero costumes, and he wasn't afraid to talk about it, and he also wasn't interested singularly in sort of immersing people in a superhero universe. He was interested in talking about his medium. He was interested in exploring what could be said, and in order to speak to a broader audience, what he needed to do was understand that this broader audience has real concerns that are valid and need to be addressed. Real people have preconceptions that are broader than those of just comic book fans, and he needed to address what those were in order for him to talk about what superheroes are and what they can be, because superheroes do exist in reality, right? They exist as media artifacts, And if we want to talk to real people about them, and there are things there that are certainly worth talking about, you have to acknowledge the perceptions that people, bring to the table. And he wasn't just only aware of it, he was leveraging those perceptions in order to make something that was appealing to them. In the 4 or 5 times I've given this talk, I have no idea how I was supposed to get to this slide, so I'll just say it. Like the superheroes in Watchmen, in Assassin's Creed, it's also a game about identity, and I think that goes back to what I was saying in the beginning about Dan. Assassin's Creed is a game about identity and immersion on some level. The way health works in this game, if you haven't played it, is you don't have hit points like you do in Doom, right? If you're playing a character, ostensibly, who is entering a Matrix-like simulation of one of his ancestors from like 1,000 years ago, and this is all in the fiction, this isn't in mechanics, entering the Matrix-like simulation of the life of his ancestor thousands of years ago that's been reconstructed from your genetic memory, right? And what happens is that simulation can only run as long as you remain in sync with the reality of those memories. So if you play the assassin dude and you run into an alley and you get stabbed to death, well, obviously the assassin dude didn't get stabbed to death 1,000 years ago, or you wouldn't be here, right? It's kind of like a paradox. If he's your ancestor, if he died, you would be dead. So what happens is when he gets stabbed a bunch of times, your health goes down, which means you've fallen out of sync with the simulation of your genetic memory. The point is, I guess, is to say that we have already made games that kind of talk about these things, even if this one's only talking about it in its story and kind of vaguely hinting towards that idea in its mechanics. And these are things that we can talk about in games that we wouldn't normally want to. So I think I've sort of made the case that there's this sort of common sort of immersion, and that's what I call immersion in content, and it's the idea that we're immersed in this place or this alternate reality. And I like this kind of immersion. I really do, and I appreciate games that have it, and I like to go to those places and enjoy them. I also hope that I've made a case that there's this other kind of immersion that I'm just going to call immersion in LEET in order to differentiate it. And this is sort of a kind of immersion in context. And I think this new immersion, it's not even new. I think this new way of looking at immersion is more central and more important and more fundamental to what games actually are. I also think that sort of new technologies and a new culture of interaction is really making this kind of immersion a lot more relevant than maybe we thought it was 5 years ago. I think that we are going to see a very, very incredible technological revolution in the next decade or so, but I don't think it's going to be very much at all like the holodeck. I think that the next iPhone is going to be in your eye, and that's kind of immaterial whether it's that or just more ubiquitous portable devices like the one I have in my pocket. But I believe that very soon, you're going to be able to walk around in Las Vegas, and it's going to be overlaid with Google Earth Las Vegas, and it's going to be connected to photosynths and embedded videos of people walking around Las Vegas and doing stuff. And you're going to have videos as well as save games and other ways to enter into GTA San Andreas, San Venturas in GTA 6 Las Vegas. And you're going to be at the same time participating in a virtual tour of Las Vegas with Terry Gilliam giving a virtual Hunter S. Thompson tour of Las Vegas while you're watching, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas starring Johnny Depp, who also happens to appear in the Imaginarium Dr. Parnassus, overlaid on your screen, talking to a bunch of strangers who you're probably connected to by only 1 or 2 degrees of separation. And all of this is going to seem really, really natural and normal. And I want to be clear that this is not really a talk about this technology, right? Like it's apparent to me traveling on this tour, taking pictures with my iPhone, that every single picture that gets taken today in 2009 or whatever year we're in is already geolocated, right? These photos being uploaded to the internet and the amount of data being stored on the internet climbing on this curve, they're all just going to be stitched together very, very soon by some kind of photosynth-like algorithm, and we're going to have these huge three-dimensional syntheses of everything that we see, and that's just going to be normal. The point is, I'm not here to talk about the technology. I'm trying to say that there's this new kind of hyper reality that's being overlaid on top of the reality that we live in, and that we need to understand what that means to people and how they interact with it in order to reshape our games and keep them relevant for people as they enter that world. So that brings me to the end of my kind of fragmentary, asynchronous parallelized talk. And over the course of the talk, I think I tried to point to a few games and a few design concepts that were sort of perhaps changing the way we think about immersion. Before we do the question period, I actually want to ask a question myself, since this talk breaks pretty much every other rule. What would a fragmentary, parallelized, asynchronous, impermanent game with substitution continuity and subscription consequence be like? And I really don't know the answer to that question. Of course, if I did, I wouldn't be sharing it. But the thing is, I'm 100% sure that even if we think that that game is going to sort of look like this on the surface and that people are going to go out and buy a hospital, people are actually going to expect and understand that fundamentally on some other level what it actually is this, and they're going to want it to behave like that, and they're going to need it to be like that, because that's going to be what it is, more importantly and centrally to them. And eventually, once we have a whole generation of people like that making games and driving the game industry of the future, we're going to come to realize that the thing that we're playing with when we're playing with these things, the thing that we've been playing with all along is us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Clint. So one of the privileges of being the interim director of the Game Center is that I get to sort of have first dibs and ask a couple of questions. I'm going to sit you down and kind of do a little Q&A, just a little interview style thing, and then we're going to open it up to the room at large and get some Q&A. So I'll promise I'll be short, but I just wanted to ask a couple of questions. So first of all, I think that it was a great talk, and I really like the framing device of the map versus the territory, and the way that you are kind of thinking through immersion. Pushing it away from this classical image of this kind of perfect seamless thing, and understanding that it's fragmented and multi-layered. And I kind of want to just ask you to talk a little bit about how that affects design practice, right? So it's very interesting kind of. Theoretically, it's super fascinating, and I think it's one of the things that makes video games feel so relevant and important in the contemporary world is the way that they deal with these issues. The idea of hyperreality, also as it's used by someone like Baudrillard, the kind of postmodern philosopher, is to kind of talk about the how hard it is to do stuff in this new world, how hard it is to find the authentic moment, and if things are like a hall of mirrors, it's very difficult to do philosophy for him, in this hall of mirrors where everything kind of slips away, and yet he does it, right? He does it by writing books. And so it's also hard to understand how games fit into this thing. But then we pick out games to play, and we decide what kind of games we want to make. So I kind of want to ask you, talk a little bit about how these ideas are influencing you as someone who plays games. What kind of games are you interested in playing, and also as someone who makes games. How is this going to affect you as a game designer? What do you have any thoughts about that?
That's a really long question.
I know. Just talk about how this impacts your design.
So let's just talk a little bit about where this talk came from, because when I first started thinking about this talk, and maybe I said it in the beginning, I thought, I was really busy working on Far Cry 2, and I thought I would do this talk I did at GDC about immersion because I thought it would be a really easy thing to talk about. Because it was one of the sort of we had these 6 sort of pillars of the game. There was freedom of gameplay. We had this acronym for remembering them, that's why I can list them. It was freedom of gameplay, open world, realism, meaning immersion was the other one, dynamism in the environment. So immersion was one of the pillars of the game, and we thought a lot about it. We made a lot of sacrifices to get it. And so I had this idea that the immersive qualities of the game would be sort of a step above sort of all the other games on the field. And in a lot of ways, I think we succeeded at that. But at the same time, while I was putting together that talk to talk about it, in fact, it was the last time I was in New York. I remember talking with Eric about it on the street, and he was like, and there's pieces about it in his book, Rules of Play, and I was realizing, at that point, I'm in over my head. I can't talk about this very seriously because I'm faking it. And that talk was kind of not what I wanted it to be once I realized how complex the problem was. So this talk came from sort of post Far Cry 2, wanting to examine all the things that we did wrong and try to find better solutions to making games, and also try and address what I felt were weaknesses in my own thinking from that previous talk. So,
what did you do wrong? And
so
how are you
right,
gonna
so
fix it?
so the example I use when I talk about immersion in Far Cry 2, if any of you have played it, I don't know, is the map and compass system. So in Far Cry 2, in most video games, you just have a little like heads-up display in the corner that shows you like a 360-degree view of where there's bad guys and where there's trucks and whatever's going on. And then there's a little pause button that shows you a full-screen map of the game world, and you can navigate with that, and the game is paused and you're safe. So for us, we didn't want that. We wanted the game to be immersive, right? So there's no mini-map HUD in the corner. There's a paper map that you hold in your hand, and so instead of having a shotgun, you unequip your shotgun and you take out your map and your GPS. There's no way to pause the game and see a map. If you pause the game, you get a menu, but there's no map. So the only way for you to navigate the game world is with this map. And it was very, very immersive, but honestly, we iterated. That thing was a horror show. Right. We spent probably millions of dollars on that map. Right? Wow. Like, we were iterating it with teams of sometimes 3 or 4 guys, sometimes 6 or 7 guys, programmers, artists, designers, putting this thing together in prototype. One of the problems with immersion is you never know if you've got it until you have all the polish in, right? You can't look at at the cubes and blocky stuff and go, yes, when that has art, it will be immersive, right? You can't know until you've gone sort of almost the whole distance to the end. And then you can sort of see, yes, it will be immersive. How much can we get out of polish, right? And so for us, it was like just going almost to the end and going, that sucks. Throw it away.
Do you wish you'd spent those design resources on?
I do. I fundamentally do. And I think those were good decisions that we made, and I think we did the right things we needed to do to pursue that goal of immersion. But I think I've been down that path. I've done what I need to do, and I think I've set a high mark for people. And if other people want to compete, they have to go there. And now I can go work on other things. And I look at if I wanted to re-optimize that problem, where can I get the most money back? And that fucking compass looks really suspicious, right? It's like, oh, I got a lot of money there, right? I can spend that on other stuff. So for me, it's like, it's not just questioning the things we did wrong, but it's like thinking about how to better give players value.
Let me see how far I can push you, because I love your talk, and sometimes I think I see you. Like what you just said, kind of like letting go of some of the things that I think of as being Clint Hawking's design principles, and it's interesting. And then sometimes I felt in the talk like you're trying to get back to them. You know what I mean? And so let me ask you another question along the same lines. Are you just interested in single player, highly narrative games?
No.
So you're not. So you could see yourself, a Clint Hawking, working on a game that's not necessarily a rich 3D world, either first person or second person, in which you're controlling a character and interacting with other synthetic characters, but maybe a different kind of game entirely.
Very definitely, I can. I mean,
really?
I don't. Yeah, for sure. I don't. In a lot of ways, I think with Splinter Cell and with Far Cry, I've done the things that I needed to do down that path. There are lots more things to do down that path, but I've gone very, very far down it, and there's a lot of other paths, right? So it's like, there's a lot of interesting ways to make games, a lot of interesting things to think about in making games. There's also, I think the game industry and our notions of what makes a great popular game are changing. Like, I see people saying, how many hundreds of millions of dollars does Call of Duty make or whatever, but that's like one kind of game, and I don't want to just say we should all make Facebook games, right? But like, how many hundreds of millions of dollars does WoW make? How many hundreds of millions of dollars do these other games make? And how much adoration does a game that doesn't make hundreds of millions of dollars, like Braid or Spider on iPhone, get from the people that matter, right? So there are lots of ways to make a game that can speak to people and can speak to the people who you're interested in speaking to without just making AAA, movie-like blockbusters. And I'm interested in what those options are.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, one of the reasons that I ask is that I think you are well known as a kind of I would say a progressivist, right? In fact, the school of progressive game design is one of the terms that's been associated with you, and there is an emerging critical community of people who are interested in pushing games as culture to be more meaningful, more mature, to speak to us in a deeper way, the way that we want, the way that music and film and theater, fit into the life of a grown-up who's interested in things beyond, childish fantasies and stuff like that. So that's and for a lot of those people, like Fulbright and people like that, I sometimes think that they take the highly narrative single-player game as the blank canvas. They're assuming that we assume is what this more progressive kind of future of games. Yeah, it might not be the holodeck, but by God, it's going to be a single-player experience that's super narrative. Right. And so for you to say no, it's actually the future of games is more fragmented, like the surface of games is more fragmented. I think that's a kind of a big deal. Coming out of your mouth.
Yeah, but I think that the people that inspired me, to be in this progressivist school, people like Warren and Harvey and Doug and those people, right? I mean, those are the people that I admire and respect and have always tried to understand what they were talking about. Even though they made these single-player immersive simulations, that's the word, the immersive sim, right? Mm-hmm. I don't actually think that was. De facto, like the place where the forward flag was planted. Yeah. I think that was where they were working, probably for the same reason that's where I was working. I think that the things that those people have been interested in and the things that I'm interested in are still more fundamental. They're things like emergent gameplay. There are things like player expression in gameplay. Yeah. We happen to have made very immersive simulations, but I don't necessarily think that those things have to be part of emergent gameplay. Or, we like rich spaces of consequence. We like games where the decisions that I make have predictable repercussions, and that I'm playing with different multiple chains of repercussions in the future. I think we maybe tend to prefer more literal, less abstract, more simulation-y games. But I don't think we're going to favor that over the emergent gameplay. And that's one of my great, one of the things that troubles me is looking at people that are making what you call these sort of single-player action-adventure narrative-focused games that are huge and mighty successful and really, really exciting and making lots of money, that don't have the emergent gameplay and don't have the sort of player agency and player choice that we've cherished, right? Yeah. So if I have to give up one of those two things, the thing I give up without question is like the sort of movie-like authored narrative immersive sim. The thing that's most important out of those two things is the emergent gameplay and the player agency and player authorship and player improvisation and stuff like that.
So, well put. So what does it mean then to be a progressivist? Like,
I don't know.
Ask
Steve.
So you mentioned some of the things you're interested in, emergence and this other stuff, but let me put it to you in a very concrete way and see what you say to this. Are contemporary video games primitive, embryonic versions of something that is coming that is going to be truly great culture?
That's a huge question.
I mean, it's pretty simple. It's yes or no. Some people think that Chris Hecker and John Blow, dear friends of ours, people that we chat with, I think they honestly believe to a certain degree that these things are embarrassing. They're like Lascaux Cave style.
Yeah, but my question. But I need to answer your question with a question. When you say contemporary video games, what do you mean? Do you mean games like Far Cry 2? Because if that's what you mean, I would say who cares? If you mean Farmville on Facebook, I would say maybe. Like, that's a game I haven't played and I don't understand, but it's very fundamentally different from the kind of game I play now. It's very successful in its context. Right. And the thing is, like, yes, if games are going to be these movie-like simulations, holodeck simulations of reality with agency, which they don't seem to be converging towards, so that seems to be crumbling by the wayside, right? But even if they do sort of pick themselves back up and get back on that path, like, sure, the answer could be yes. Yeah. But I see that as being this narrowing stream of, like, more and more niche, like, Vin Diesel stuff, and then I see the entire other reality of games, and I would say yes, everything else besides, and I'm not going to name some current very popular movie-like games that seem to have very low agency, but they're moving off in that direction, and then all of the other games, which a lot of them also have low agency, maybe those are the embryonic future of something that's one day going to be high human culture. I don't know, because I haven't made any of those games yet, so I have to.
I think there are lots of people who would say that. Well, whatever. I mean, I think. It's nicely dodged. Let's put it that way. Well dodged. I don't know how to press you any further. So point hawking. I want to open it up to the audience. Before I do, I want to Yeah, I mean, there's other things that I want to get into related to this, but they are, I think, a little bit more about the theoretical side of what you're talking about. I find it incredibly interesting and tantalizing. I think what you're circling around is a notion of the relationship of games to truth and realness, and the stuff you showed about movies is so interesting, and the relationship of a film, of a feature film, to the concrete reality of a documentary of like Utah Beach, the thread that connects those things, but also the relationship of a feature film to the concrete reality of the human beings, Tom Hanks as a living person, as you know, and with the lens opens up, and that person is actually standing in front of the camera,
Right.
and how, you know, and what is the equivalent in games is like a, you know, this is what your talk has kind of led me to wonder, and I don't know if there is an answer to that.
Yeah, and
that's
I
relative to your talk.
undoubtedly apologize for how like abstract and theoretical this talk is. I really kind of try not to be really abstract and theoretical, but just trying to talk about these subjects is really, really difficult, and it's really confusing, and they're shifting and moving, and you're always trying to pin something to the table so you can talk about it for 3 or 4 more sentences. Yeah. So it's unfortunate, but I think you're right. I think that the things that we're really talking about are fundamental to what games are and how they're meaningful to us and why they're meaningful to us. Yeah. And yeah, some of the things that were most inspiring to me in working on this talk was seeing these interesting through lines in how our perception evolved, and realizing, you know, that from this World War II footage, you know, as an example, to Paths of Glory, to Spielberg, and from the reality of it to Gears of War, the thing that's real in there isn't actually anything that anybody ever created. Everyone's always dancing around the outside of this thing, yeah. And the meaning in the thing that's beautiful about it comes from nowhere, yeah. Or nowhere that I can point to and say that's where it came from. And I think that's really fascinating to me.
Well, I agree with you. I think that it's tricky and complicated stuff, and I almost feel that any really serious and honest and committed attempt to sit down and really think through games always kind of leads one to philosophical questions, yeah. and that's peculiar to games in some ways. And I think one of the things that's missing from a lot of contemporary mainstream design practice is people who are willing to step back and kind of think about these issues the way that you are doing it. So I actually think it's quite wonderful that you've done that and shared that with us. And especially in the context of the Game Center at NYU, where we're really interested in these questions, and not just the idea of how to make games and how to make better games, but also how to think about games and how to understand how games are meaningful. And you know, so maybe I'll end on one question, which is, as we grow the Game Center and we're kind of putting together an actual program in game development, let me just ask you, what are the qualities you would look for from students who are coming out of a program, if you were looking to work with them on a project? You know, like what are the things you would hope that they would be studying and thinking about and learning?
So that's a really hard question, because I mean, like 5 or 6 years ago, probably the first time I went to visit different schools and see people's game programs, my answer was like, get Unreal and learn how to make models, because like we need to find a way to put you in a chair in order to like give you a job, right? And it's still to this day, it's, you know, we don't hire creative directors out of school, right? We don't hire lead designers out of school. But I mean now, and very much to my surprise, you know, most of our projects have, and these are big projects with hundreds of people on them, right? But a project like Assassin's Creed has a dozen game designers on it or more, right? And a few of those guys are out of school. It's their first game, right? They're kind of junior game designers, but they're not guys who learned how to make a model of a chair, right? And became, you know, an artist and then a level designer, and like that's kind of how in some ways how I did it. Not through school, but now it's really like the people coming out of schools are fucking educated, and they no, but I mean they have all of this knowledge that, you know, could only be gotten even 5 years ago by like hunting it down and knowing specific individuals who could point you to their work and reading about it and figuring it out for yourself. Now it's just like guys like you and people who teach this stuff who are guys like me in some sense, have all this information and just download it to everybody. And so it's like you're just this huge step closer. So I mean, what I need from an aspiring game designer or an aspiring, game industry professional is just, it's the same thing I need from any of my coworkers and would or would not want them on my team. I need passionate people, dedicated people, smart people, for lack of a better word, people who think outside the box, people who are creative thinkers. I worked with I won't name any names, but I worked with a very junior designer on my last project who, most of my effort was spent not trying to teach him how to design stuff. He knew how to do all of that. It was to try and get him to let go of the things that he said he believed had to be part of, like, I don't want to be too specific, had to be part of the things that he was tasked of designing. And it was kind of trying to break down, it wasn't just trying to break down his preconceptions, but it was trying to get him to have confidence that he could do something creative and something that was unique to him. So, I mean, I need that too. I need people who are confident enough to be creative. And that's hard, right? Like,
Yeah, well said. So let me open it up to the audience for Q&A, and I'll start us off right here.
Hi.
Hey.
I'm interested in, and I figure you're a good guy to ask about this, like where narrative, in terms of how it is actually implemented in a game. And I'm trying to design like a narrative engine, like a physics engine, but it handles reacting to the player and creating a story around it.
Chris Crawford.
I got you. Yeah. And I mean, is this something like? Does this make? Part of it is just simply my ignorance of how narrative is constructed in a game. Like, is it done, with the designers and the programmers and everybody? I mean, is this something that happens? Like, is this something that could happen? Is it something where all of a sudden you have story engine designers, or there's something like a Havoc engine for story that gets parsed around to different games?
I'm certain. Okay, so I'm certainly not the guy to ask, depending on how far you're interested in going, right? If you want to make a narrative engine that's like a 3D rendering engine, then there are guys who've actually gone the algorithmic path, like Chris Crawford and a few other people who've gone down that path. If you're more talking about how to get non-algorithmically, non-engine core story working in a game, I think there's a lot of design theory about it. There's lots of concepts about how to make the player invested in characters, how to make the player invested in the actions that he's performing that have nothing really to do with building an engine. It's just techniques of, it's like camera techniques in filmmaking have nothing to do with the physics of light and optics, right? They have to do with positioning and, proportion and lighting and all those kinds of things. So I think there's two separate questions. For the algorithmic stuff, I have no idea.
Yeah.
And I'm not really interested. And then on the other side, the technique side, I could talk about that for 12 hours. But I think that there's, I think we're getting very, very much better at this stuff. Like I think even looking at games like Batman, games like Uncharted, the things they're doing, not in cutscenes, but in game to try and build investment in characters. Games like Splinter Cell, I think, did good job of that stuff years ago, and people are building on it and iterating it and trying different stuff. But it's all specific case stuff. It's like in this 3D environment with this kind of lighting, in order to make it's very, very authored, even though it can be very, very dynamic in play.
Yeah, and that's like what's frustrating with me about it, because like for Far Cry 2, perfect example. Like I played this game, and I think I talked about this in our class last year. Like I would only use found weapons, like because I wanted that experience. Like and that was part of what I wanted for my character. I sort of made up this whole idea of who he was and what he was doing there, and like. Yeah, I mean, I really have a lot of ideas about that, but like, I wanted something back from the game for that. I know, and I mean, I tried to figure out how it was possible. So that goes into this. Like, part of that is me trying to make something that will do that.
Right. So I think, okay, so to answer that specific question, I think there's, I think we did a particularly bad job. We gave the player a very, very big sandbox and a very, very interesting sandbox. And I said this at a previous version of this talk. A lot of people criticize the game for being repetitive, and it sounds like me being a pretentious prick to say it, but in a lot of ways, in my opinion, it's the players being repetitive and playing in repetitive ways that makes the game repetitive. That said, we didn't do anything in the design to encourage them not to be repetitive, so it's our fault that that's the way they played it, right? So the question is, like, how can we invite and encourage and reward players to go out into those edge cases of the design and play permadeath like Ben's doing, or play with only rusted weapons like you were doing, or explore other interesting parts of the design, because in my opinion, those are some of the most interesting parts of the game, right? And even when I play the game, like, I try to stop using rusted weapons immediately. And a lot of people would complain, it sucks that all the games are rusty. It's because they didn't maybe figure out that you actually never have to deal with that problem if you just take a couple very small early steps, and it's not an issue. But then a lot of other people think it's really cool, and they think it's fun and more authentic and throws stuff back at them. So we did a bad job, probably because we were spending so much money on our fucking map and compass, of getting the players to go out and explore those things, and rewarding them in some ways for playing around in those parts of the sandbox. So, yeah.
Thanks. Thank you.
I found the image of the Legos kind of at the end in some ways very compelling, and I was trying to think of how that works, and the idea of playing with the meta structure as the game itself made me think of more tabletop style games like Nomic or Mao, where the rules are the game, and the idea is that you as you play, you reconstruct them, and that is the gameplay more than the rules themselves as
right.
sort of the structure. And it makes me wonder, how possible is that to do in a programmed environment where you actually have this high level interpreter that beyond what I guess I could learn C and rewrite your game, but then that I wouldn't be doing that as a form of play. And you can do this in a social environment because we're really, really good at hacking social environments. It's kind of intuitive for us. And so do you think that is there some worry in your head that there's an upper limit to how we can do this technologically, design games of this sort, or do you have a solution to that?
So just to talk kind of pie in the sky, I mean, at one point we were talking about doing our difficulty balancing in Far Cry as just having easy, medium, and hard like every other game has, or whatever we ended up calling them, and then advanced, which was go to this page and there's just 5 pages of sliders. You want to turn up bullet damage and turn down recoil and turn all of this stuff in all these crazy ways, and basically manipulating any rule in the game that's a kind of a slider, and let the player have fun with that. You want to turn up the rate of fire propagation, or make everything raining all the time, or play around with the mood, play around with damage, play around with movement speeds, play around with all of that stuff. I mean, that's literally exposing big chunks of the low level mechanics and the subsequent dynamics to the player to manipulate. At the same time, it was very hard to do and expensive. I'm not sure what the value is in that, because you're really just saying, you can make bullets do 0 damage, or you can make them do 1,000 damage. It's still, in a lot of ways, still the same. There could be some interesting combinations. I think using things like achievements and finding ways to better leverage things that are going on in social spaces around your game to encourage players, again, the permadeath thing with Ben, trying to find ways with your community management to call attention to that, get more people playing in this permanent death experiment and having fun in that space if they're interested, talk about it. All those things are kind of fun. Having a turn on permadeath, turn off permadeath click button in the main menu, I don't know how valuable that is. So there's kind of this trade-off between what kind of behaviors can we encourage and reward with sliders and achievements and options in the menus, and what kind of stuff can we encourage through the broader, like you said, the broader social space around your game, and try and get people to experiment. And I'm very interested in all of that stuff, for sure.
That's a great answer. It reminds me a little bit of was it Warren Spector who talked about, you can solve a lot of these problems by just adding other people. But it felt like cheating to him. He was like,
right.
I want to do that. That's cheating. And yet it's so true. I was when you were talking about Left 4 Dead, and you were talking about me going to the bathroom, which I kind of need to do right now. But anyway, you were saying we would never notice because he goes and he makes a sandwich and he comes back, and I tell you a situation in which you would absolutely notice if we were playing competitive, high level competitive Left 4 Dead. I don't know if teams, but I'm sure there are teams of Left 4 Dead players and as soon as I put down the mic and I'm not responding, and I'm no longer like on point, you would know in a second.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
And
yeah.
that's what makes and that's typically how these problems have gotten solved for
Right,
thousands
sure,
of years.
sure.
It's repetitive to hit a ball over a net.
Right.
Well, how many times are you going to do that?
Right.
You put another person on the other side, and you will do it for your entire life.
Well, it would
so it does. In a weird way, it feels like cheating. But what is the problem you're trying to solve?
Right.
You know?
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting to think what is the fundamental difference between the experience of playing with you in a very highly competitive environment in Left 4 Dead against the AI zombies, right? Trying to compete for high score worldwide
where it
rankings or
really
something,
matters. Yeah.
versus playing when you go to the bathroom and Zoe replaces you, where I would notice. Where it really matters, I would notice.
It's the difference
But
between a haunted house and a game, like
Right.
a competitive
And-
game. A haunted house is like entertainment.
but the interesting question is, to how many people does that difference matter? Like, and Left 4 Dead does a very, very good example of making that a question irrelevant to like 99% of players, right?
And
That's what's a beautiful thing about it.
One of the
Like,
potential answers is that some games are extremely well designed and beautiful, hauntingly beautiful haunted houses, right? I mean,
Right.
And that's okay. Like that's cool. Like that's, but that's not. You're not saying that that's necessarily the way forward for you, if it ever was anymore. Like that
No,
idea
yeah.
of a beautiful, like pristine, like experience that I'm moving through.
Right.
That it's this
I
environment.
mean, I'm not saying I'm not saying I wouldn't do it. I'm just saying, like, I've done a lot of exploring over there, and it's now apparent to me that there's so much more exploring to do, and I would like to do that if I can, right?
Are there other questions? It's so convenient to go down here right to the front, and then let's take it back after this from Matt.
Sorry, you can have it in a second. My question is actually really short. You talked about how much of a waste you thought the compass and the map were in Far Cry, and how you
I
didn't
said
really-
expensive. I don't know.
expensive.
Maybe
how
I
you'd
said waste.
Use that time for other things. And then you also talked about the Vegas Strip and having this overlay of things on your eye, basically, as you walk down. It almost seems like you're saying that you see the direction things going is that reality is going to become more like video games, where you have this heads-up display in your real life, and whether or not I mean, first of all, am I correct in that assumption? And also,
Well,
do you think that's a good or bad thing?
I mean, I think Jane is probably the person to ask about that, but I think a lot of people think reality is going to become more like video games. I think there are, applications on my iPhone that I play video game-like things on, right? Like the thing I use to count my calories kind of has a video game feel to it in some ways. The thing I use to like log into all of the places that I visit and pick up and trade bats and scarves with people like has a video game like feel to it. I don't even know what's going on, but it's like just pushing these buttons that games have pushed. I think it's fun. It makes tweeting "I am here" a little more interesting if I can pick up a bat when I'm there. I don't know. So maybe reality is going to have sort of game things layered on over top of it. I don't know that that's the. I don't know that sort of augmented reality overlays are the future of gaming. I think there's interesting things to explore there for sure.
Is there another couple hands up? So let's do a couple more questions in the back, and then we'll wrap it up.
Glad you can make it down for this series. So my question deals sort of with your immersion and with your Generations lectures.
Okay.
And with a lot of the imagery, the World War II imagery that was in this talk, and it's the sort of question you might get from a 5-year-old, but why? If immersion and it's a lot of these low agency cinematic experiences, but I work in shooters, and so much of it is shooting people in the face, and if that's what's currently being viewed as successful, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on why that is something that is an experience we want to deliver to players.
So are you asking why we would want to make shooters? Or are you asking why we would want to make games that aren't shooters?
Why we are making shooters and making them more immersive?
I think because they're predictably profitable. I think it's a very easy answer. We've been making, the whole Generation X snake eating its tail thing, it's very easy to make games for an established audience that buys a lot of games, and you know what kind of games they like to buy, and you know that they're going to rate those games highly if they have certain features, so you just can keep throwing chum into that shark pool, and it's just going to keep eating, right? I wonder, one of the reasons I ask these questions is probably the same reason you're asking that question, is like how how much bigger is that shark pool gonna get? There aren't a lot more. There aren't a lot more guys in Generation X buying a lot more games. Maybe the sort of the leading edge of the Generation Y guys are buying a lot of those games too. I don't know. It seems to be the case because the sales are kind of ramping up. But I don't know. I don't know if those are the only kinds of games they're buying, and I don't think those are the only kinds of games they're interested in. And I think that there's going to be a lot of resolution that needs to come out of the marketplace in trying to figure out where those games fit in the future.
I particularly appreciated your point that possibly one of the reasons that World War II games were so successful was because it was some sort of way of connecting to things that our grandparents did when it was very clear conflict, good versus evil, and it was a way to meet with them. But I've got buddies coming back overseas now that are either physically or mentally maimed, and I'm sitting there thinking, you take the consequences out of this, and hey, we'll sell you what they just did for a year.
For sure,
there's entertainment.
For sure, well, we can aspire to what our grandparents did, but it's a lot harder to aspire to what our high school buddy, best friend, did when he comes back without a leg. I think, right? Yeah.
So in the back, and then maybe in the black sweater.
Hey, how are you? Thank you for coming and the talk. It's very interesting. I particularly enjoyed the when you were talking about movies and film, because it's the seminar I skipped to come to this talk. But the how your immersion was shattered when Kubrick went from a master shot to a tracking shot and back and forth, and it got me thinking about cinematics in video games, and I'd like to know what you think about how cinematic sequences affect immersion in video games. And do you think there's a medium, like, say, some God of War boss battles where, you get this command sequence that you have to press? Do you think that would make it more immersive?
So I'm pretty. My opinions on this are pretty well known, so I might as well not hide it. I mean, I hate cinematics in video games. I just hate it. I hate it mostly because, not unlike the map and the compass, they're very, very expensive. Fortunately, they're predictably expensive, so that's one strength of them. But I also, I have, for whatever reason personally, very strong disconnections between, playing my character, running over a bunch of old ladies on the way to get a mission, and then walking into a room and being all cool Nico and jiving with my cousin or whatever. It's like, dude, I just ran over a bunch of old ladies. It was like it was crazy, and it's like, why am I behaving like this, right? So there's this weird, I have a very powerful feeling of disconnecting from the game when I'm being shown what my character thinks and feels, when it doesn't map closely to what I think and feel. That's me. And similarly with the sort of quick time events that you're talking about, I have this really powerful disconnect with my feelings of agency in the game when I feel like I'm doing stuff that's really analog and really rich and expressive, and then suddenly I have to break everything that's in my input stream and press X, X, B, A in the right order in order to accomplish something. So I mean, both of those things in a different way kind of jar me in ways that I don't like. It's not a question of them breaking my immersion, right, which is a different topic entirely. It's a question of them sort of making me feel uncomfortably not associated with my action and input, right? Which I don't like.
So why don't we do one more question? The gentleman in the beard.
Hey, yeah, I'll try to make this pretty quick. But throughout the talk, you spoke of immersion as if it was an ingredient, right? Like when you were talking about that last layer of polish, it's like, oh, if we do this, then this will be immersive.
Right.
But earlier in the talk, you were sort of drawing a comparison of Paths of Glory not being immersive for you, but maybe being immersive for your parents, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is there any sense that maybe immersion is not a property that one adds to a game? That immersion is a property of an experience that it's an entirely subjective thing? I mean, I'm just wondering, because it seemed like a contradiction in your own thoughts about it. I'm wondering if you could articulate that difference a little more.
I think you probably just said it better than I could. That's a really good observation, and that's definitely something I'll have to think about. Yeah, I don't know how to respond. I would say off the top of my head, there's definitely something to what you're saying. It's definitely subjective to the individual, what he or she finds immersive. And I think when I was talking about sort of pursuing this holodeck, vision of immersion, the kinds of immersion we tried to put into Far Cry, the kind of immersion we spent so much money on with that map and compass, was sort of pursuing my own idea of what would make an immersive experience for guys like me, right? For an audience like me. And so, yeah, there is a certain, I mean, it's like saying, when Steven Spielberg makes a movie, he's making something that he suspects will be immersive for him, I imagine, and for guys like him. So, yeah, there's this weird subjective nature of what actually is immersive. But yeah, that bears more thinking about for sure. Thanks.
Makes me think of one of the things that you talk about in you have a great article on something you refer to as ludonarrative dissonance in BioShock. And you make reference to that IKEA commercial. You talk about the moment in BioShock where the rug is pulled out under you and you're shown that what you thought you were doing from a narrative point of view is really not happening. And
right.
the player is made to feel like an idiot for suspending his disbelief or for believing in a certain thing. And how angry that made you. And you made a reference to the IKEA commercial with the lamp,
right.
where they make fun of you for feeling sorry.
Where the guy like Jesper comes out and laughs at you for.
It is Jesper. They show you this lamp and they make it very they make you feel
the lamp
sorry
looks
for
very
it, like
sad.
like a
yeah.
Character.
Yeah.
They anthropomorphize it, and then at the end the guy comes out and says, "Why be an idiot? It's just a lamp."
Haha, you are so foolish, laughing at a lamp.
So the thing that I find interesting about that is that that's a wonderful commercial, right?
It is. It's
and
a delightful
happening there, I think
commercial.
it was directed by Spike Jonze.
It was,
that
yeah.
commercial. And really what's happening there is not that a joke is being played on you, but that you are being let in on a joke.
Right.
And it makes me think that, that's one of the ways out of the Hall of Mirrors, that, the hyper real, all of the kind of the problems of trying to grasp at the authentic, in this as it recedes endlessly in these reflections, that one of the ways is just to let it go, right? And we just stop grasping. And we still write books, and we still fall in love and get married, and we still make games and play games, and so I like this new direction for you. That I've always felt about you as a designer, as someone who is very driven by a kind of purity of theoretical goals. And that maybe part of what you're saying is that your goals are becoming a little more fragmented in themselves. Like you no longer see like, oh, there's a single path forward, and that you're happy to let that go and you're going to make games and see what happens. And I'm really excited to see the games that you make.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, Clint Hawking.